The blindfold came away from Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto's eyes like a curtain lifting on an impossible stage. Where he had expected the cramped deck of an American destroyer, steel stretched before him in all directions, wider than the main boulevard of Tokyo, longer than any runway he had ever seen. The salt wind carried not just the familiar smell of the sea, but something else entirely, the deep industrial hum of a floating city. Above his head, aircraft engines thundered in formation, their shadows racing across a flight deck that seemed to vanish into the horizon itself. For a man who had served aboard Japan's finest battleships, who had believed he understood the scale of naval power, this moment shattered every assumption he carried. This was not a warship as he knew them. This was something beyond his vocabulary, beyond his nation's imagination, beyond the very limits of what he had thought possible at sea. The march to the prison quarters began immediately. But for the Japanese officers among the captured crew, each step revealed another impossibility. Commander Hiroshi Saito, formerly of the destroyer Fubuki, found himself walking alongside steel corridors wide enough for 3 men to pass comfortably. On his own ship, 2 sailors could barely squeeze past each other in the narrow passageways. Here, the Americans had built their vessel with a generosity of space that seemed almost wasteful. The overhead clearance rose high enough that even tall men walked without stooping, and the corridors stretched in straight lines that disappeared into distant shadows. When the prisoners descended into what their escorts called the hangar deck, the true magnitude struck them like a physical blow. The space opened before them like the interior of an aircraft factory, a cavern of steel that could have housed their entire destroyer with room to spare. Rows of aircraft sat in perfect formation, their wings folded like sleeping birds, stretching away in numbers that defied counting. Petty Officer Kenji Nakamura, who had served on the carrier Shokaku before his transfer to surface vessels, whispered to his fellow prisoners that this single deck held more planes than his former ship could carry in total. The Americans moved through this mechanical forest with casual efficiency. Mechanics crawling over engines, technicians checking instruments, ordnance crews loading ammunition with the rhythm of factory workers. What struck the Japanese prisoners most profoundly was not just the quantity of aircraft, but their quality. These were not the aging fighters and bombers that Japan had increasingly fielded as the war progressed. These machines gleamed with fresh paint and new construction, their engines humming with the sound of abundant fuel and perfect maintenance. Lieutenant Yoshio Tanaka, captured after the sinking of his cruiser near Guadalcanal, had grown accustomed to the chronic shortages that plagued the Imperial Navy. On Japanese ships, every gallon of fuel was precious, every spare part hoarded, every piece of equipment nursed along far beyond its intended lifespan. Yet here, American sailors worked with an abundance that seemed almost criminal in its excess. He watched mechanics discard parts that Japanese engineers would have carefully repaired and reused. He saw fuel lines running to aircraft with no apparent concern for conservation. The philosophical difference became clear as the prisoners observed the American approach to naval aviation. Japanese carriers concentrated their strength in elite squadrons, each pilot a carefully trained warrior expected to achieve perfection with minimal resources. The American system, by contrast, seemed built on the assumption of abundance. They carried more aircraft than they could possibly need, more fuel than any rational calculation would require, more spare parts than prudent logistics would suggest. It was a philosophy that treated materials as renewable rather than precious, that planned for sustained operations rather than decisive single engagements. As the prisoners were led deeper into the ship, past workshops humming with activity and storage areas packed with supplies, they began to understand that they were witnessing more than just a larger vessel. This was an entirely different conception of what a warship could be. Where Japanese naval doctrine emphasized concentration and efficiency, the Americans had embraced redundancy and excess. Where Japanese ships were designed as elegant weapons optimized for specific roles, this floating city seemed designed to absorb damage, sustain operations, and project power over vast distances without regard for the normal limitations of sea warfare. The realization settled over them like a cold weight. They were prisoners not just of an enemy fleet, but of an enemy philosophy that made their own approach to war seem quaint and inadequate. The scale they witnessed was not merely impressive. It was a declaration that America fought by different rules entirely. The first meal aboard the carrier shattered whatever remained of the prisoners' understanding of wartime reality. Chief Petty Officer Masao Hayashi had not tasted fresh meat in 8 months, subsisting on the dwindling rations that had become standard throughout the Imperial Navy. When American sailors led the prisoners to a mess hall that could have seated the entire crew of a Japanese destroyer, the abundance spread before them seemed like a fever dream. Trays loaded with portions that exceeded what many Japanese sailors received in an entire day. Fresh vegetables that had been impossible to obtain in the forward areas of the Pacific. Bread so white and soft, it seemed like a luxury reserved for admirals. Commander Saito found himself staring at a pitcher of fresh milk, a substance that had vanished from Japanese ships so long ago that younger sailors barely remembered its taste. The American guards encouraged the prisoners to eat, displaying a casual generosity that felt almost insulting to men who had watched their own comrades weaken from malnutrition. Lieutenant Tanaka later recalled the psychological assault of witnessing enemy sailors complain about the quality of food that surpassed anything he had eaten in 2 years of service. The medical facilities proved even more devastating to Japanese morale. When Petty Officer Nakamura developed a fever during his second day of captivity, he was taken to what the Americans called the sick bay. The space resembled a civilian hospital more than anything he had seen at sea. Clean white sheets, proper surgical equipment, and enough medical supplies to treat hundreds of patients. The ship's doctor examined him with instruments that Japanese medical officers could only dream of possessing, prescribing medications that had been unavailable to the Imperial Navy since 1942. Japanese prisoners who had served on their own carriers described the contrast with bitter clarity. On the Shokaku, medical treatment consisted of a single doctor with basic supplies struggling to treat wounded pilots and sailors with whatever materials could be scrounged. Serious injuries often meant death, simply because proper equipment was not available. Yet here, Americans treated minor ailments with resources that Japanese ships reserved for the most critical emergencies. The recreational spaces discovered throughout the ship presented perhaps the most incomprehensible luxury. Prisoners found themselves walking past areas equipped with exercise equipment, libraries stocked with books and magazines, and even spaces where movies were projected for entertainment. Commander Yamamoto, who had endured months of cramped quarters, where off-duty time meant lying in a narrow bunk surrounded by the constant noise of machinery, could barely process the concept of a warship designed for human comfort. American sailors worked out in gymnasiums while their ships sailed through combat zones. They gathered in lounges to read novels and write letters home. They lined up at barber shops for proper haircuts and shaves. Each of these amenities represented a philosophy that Japanese officers found nearly impossible to understand. How could a nation afford such luxuries while fighting a war? How could they justify the weight and space devoted to comfort when every ton should have been dedicated to weapons and ammunition? The casual waste observed throughout the ship proved equally demoralizing. American sailors discarded clothing that Japanese servicemen would have carefully mended and reused. They threw away food that would have been precious on any Japanese vessel. Machinery was replaced rather than repaired. Spare parts were ordered in quantities that seemed almost reckless. Lieutenant Tanaka watched American mechanics discard engine components that Japanese engineers would have rebuilt multiple times before declaring them unusable. The abundance extended beyond material goods to encompass the very atmosphere of the ship. American sailors moved with a confidence born of knowing that supplies would continue to flow, that replacements for damaged equipment would arrive, that their basic needs would be met regardless of circumstances. This psychological security manifested in ways that Japanese prisoners found deeply troubling. Where Japanese crews operated under constant pressure to conserve and economize, Americans seemed to assume that abundance was natural and permanent. Personal hygiene facilities provided another stark contrast. Hot showers with unlimited water, soap that smelled of luxury rather than harsh chemicals, towels that were replaced regularly rather than used until they fell apart. For prisoners who had grown accustomed to washing with cold salt water and sleeping in clothes worn for weeks at a time, these amenities felt like glimpses into a different world entirely. The psychological impact accumulated with each discovered luxury. These men had been raised in a culture that glorified sacrifice and endurance, that found virtue in accepting hardship for the greater good. Yet here, they encountered an enemy that had found ways to provide comfort and abundance, even in the midst of total war. The implication was terrifying. America was so wealthy, so industrially powerful, that it could afford to wage war without requiring its people to sacrifice basic human comforts. The morning alarm that woke the prisoners on their third day aboard brought with it a sound that would haunt their understanding of naval warfare forever. Above their heads, the thunder of aircraft engines roared to life in coordinated symphony, followed by the rhythmic pounding of planes being launched from the flight deck. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto had witnessed carrier operations before, but nothing had prepared him for the scale and precision of what the Americans called flight quarters. From the observation areas where prisoners were allowed during daylight hours, they watched in stunned silence as wave after wave of aircraft lifted off the deck in perfectly timed sequences. The coordination resembled a mechanical ballet performed by hundreds of men in colored jerseys, each movement rehearsed to split-second precision. Yellow-shirted aircraft directors guided planes across the deck with hand signals that seemed like a complex dance. Blue-shirted plane handlers moved aircraft with the efficiency of factory workers on an assembly line. Red-shirted ordnance crews, armed bombers, and fighters, with an abundance of ammunition that staggered the Japanese observers. Chief Petty Officer Hayashi, who had served on airfields throughout the Pacific, counted the planes launching in a single morning strike and reached numbers that exceeded the total aircraft complement of most Japanese bases. The Americans were sending more planes on a single mission than Japan could muster for major operations. Each aircraft that thundered overhead represented not just firepower, but the industrial capacity to build, fuel, and maintain a war machine of unprecedented scale. Commander Saito found himself calculating the implications with growing dread. A single American carrier could project more air power than multiple Japanese airfields combined. These floating cities carried their own air forces wherever they sailed, making traditional concepts of defensive positions meaningless. No island was too remote, no fleet too fast, no installation too well hidden to escape the reach of these mobile airfields. The maintenance operations visible in the hangar decks revealed another revolutionary aspect of American carrier aviation. Japanese aircraft were maintained by skilled mechanics working with limited tools and spare parts, nursing engines and airframes far beyond their intended service life. Here, the Americans had created floating factories, capable of performing major overhauls at sea. Prisoners watched as damaged aircraft were not just repaired, but completely rebuilt. Engines replaced rather than patched, entire sections of airframe discarded and renewed. Petty Officer Nakamura, who had worked on aircraft maintenance at Rabaul, observed American mechanics performing procedures that would have required returning planes to major industrial facilities in Japan. Complete engine changes accomplished in hours rather than days. Structural repairs that Japanese crews would have considered impossible without shipyard support. The carriers carried machine shops, welding equipment, and spare parts inventories that rivaled major land-based facilities. The pace of operations proved equally overwhelming. Where Japanese carriers required careful planning and extended preparation for major strikes, the Americans seemed capable of launching attacks almost continuously. Fresh aircraft replaced returning ones in endless rotation. Damaged planes were quickly repaired or replaced from the seemingly inexhaustible reserves stored below decks. The rhythm never stopped, creating constant pressure that traditional naval forces could not match. Lieutenant Tanaka realized that Japanese naval aviation had been fighting an entirely different kind of war. Japanese pilots were elite warriors, carefully trained and expected to achieve decisive results through skill and sacrifice. American aviation, by contrast, seemed built on the principle of overwhelming volume. They could afford to send dozens of aircraft where Japan might send a handful, knowing that losses could be quickly replaced and missions repeated until objectives were achieved. The intelligence gathered from overheard conversations among American aircrews painted an even more disturbing picture. These carriers were not operating alone, but as part of task forces that included multiple floating airfields. The Americans had created not just individual ship-based air forces, but entire fleets of mobile aviation platforms that could concentrate hundreds of aircraft at any point in the Pacific. Prisoners learned that the carrier they were aboard was considered typical rather than exceptional. American shipyards were producing these giants in quantities that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as propaganda. Each new carrier launched carried more aircraft than most Japanese installations could support, creating a geometric expansion of American air power that traditional defenses could not hope to counter. The tactical implications became clear. As prisoners witnessed combat operations firsthand, American carrier aircraft provided continuous coverage for fleet movements, eliminating the windows of vulnerability that Japanese forces had learned to exploit. They conducted reconnaissance missions that extended American vision hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. They struck at targets that had previously considered themselves safe behind vast oceanic distances. The revolution in naval warfare was complete and undeniable. These floating airfields had made traditional concepts of sea power obsolete, replacing battleship guns with aviation wings that could reach further, strike harder, and operate with a sustainability that no land-based force could match. The crushing revelation came not through dramatic announcement, but through casual conversations overheard in the ship's corridors. American sailors spoke with matter-of-fact confidence about sister ships, about carriers under construction, about production schedules that treated these massive vessels as routine products rather than miraculous achievements. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto found himself listening in horrified fascination as crew members discussed the USS Essex, the USS Intrepid, the USS Yorktown, rolling off the names of carriers as if they were discussing different models of automobiles. A young American mechanic, unaware that prisoners were within earshot, complained to his buddy about being transferred to a newer carrier when his current ship returned to port for refit. The casual nature of the conversation struck the Japanese officers like a physical blow. This vessel that dwarfed anything in the Imperial Navy was considered old enough to require upgrading. The Americans were building these giants so rapidly that ships less than 2 years old were already being improved upon. Commander Saito, who had spent years watching Japan struggle to complete a single new carrier, learned from intercepted communications that American shipyards were launching one Essex-class carrier every month. The numbers seemed impossible, like propaganda designed to demoralize prisoners, yet the evidence surrounded them. The quality of construction, the abundance of materials, the casual confidence of the crew, all pointed to a production capability that Japan could not begin to match. Chief Petty Officer Hayashi had worked in the Kure naval arsenal before the war, where the construction of a single major warship represented a national effort requiring years of careful resource management. He understood the immense industrial capacity needed to build vessels of this scale. The steel alone required for one American carrier exceeded Japan's monthly production of high-grade naval steel. Yet the Americans were completing these ships faster than Japan could build destroyers. The prisoners began to piece together the broader picture through fragments of information gathered during their captivity. Intelligence reports discussed in their presence revealed that American shipyards stretched along both coasts, each facility capable of building multiple carriers simultaneously. The Kaiser Shipyards, the Newport News Facility, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, all names that carried the weight of industrial capabilities beyond Japanese comprehension. Petty Officer Nakamura, who had served in logistics, calculated the resources required to sustain just one carrier task force. The fuel consumption alone exceeded what many Japanese bases received in an entire month. The ammunition expended in a single major strike required production capabilities that strained Japan's entire industrial capacity. Yet the Americans maintained multiple carrier groups operating simultaneously across the vast Pacific, each one consuming resources at rates that would have bankrupted smaller nations. The psychological impact deepened when prisoners learned that the carrier holding them was considered expendable in American strategic planning. Where Japan treated each major warship as an irreplaceable national treasure, Americans built their carriers with the assumption that losses were acceptable as long as replacements continued flowing from the shipyards. This fundamental difference in approach revealed an industrial confidence that Japan simply could not match. Lieutenant Tanaka realized that Japan was fighting not just against American naval forces, but against American industrial civilization itself. The carriers represented the visible manifestation of a production system that could simultaneously supply military forces, maintain civilian prosperity, and expand capacity for future conflicts. While Japan stripped its civilian economy to support the war effort, America seemed capable of producing for war without sacrificing domestic abundance. The implications extended beyond immediate military concerns to questions of national survival. If America could build carriers at this pace during wartime, what would their peacetime industrial capacity become? The prisoners found themselves confronting the reality that they were witnessing not just superior tactics or equipment, but a fundamental mismatch in national capabilities that no amount of courage or sacrifice could overcome. Conversations among American officers revealed planning horizons that stretched far beyond the current conflict. They discussed post-war fleet compositions, technological improvements for future carrier classes, and industrial investments that assumed victory was merely a matter of time and production schedules. The casual confidence with which they planned for the future revealed a certainty born of overwhelming material advantage. The final crushing realization came when prisoners learned that the massive carrier holding them was considered a standard production model rather than a showcase of American capabilities. Newer classes were already under development, incorporating lessons learned from current operations and pushing the boundaries of size and capability even further. Japan was fighting yesterday's war while America was already building tomorrow's fleet. The industrial reality surrounding them made any hope of Japanese victory seem not just unlikely, but mathematically impossible. They were prisoners of a nation that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them, that could expand capacity while Japan's industrial base crumbled under bombing and resource shortages. The carriers were not just ships, but symbols of an industrial juggernaut that had mobilized the resources of an entire continent for war. Perhaps more disturbing than the material abundance was the realization that American success stemmed from an entirely different philosophy of human organization. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto, raised in the rigid hierarchies of the Imperial Navy, watched in bewilderment as American sailors operated with a freedom of initiative that would have been unthinkable on Japanese vessels. Petty officers made decisions without consulting superiors. Enlisted men offered suggestions to officers without fear of punishment. The casual interaction between ranks violated every principle of naval discipline that Japanese officers held sacred. Chief Petty Officer Hayashi observed the daily routine aboard the carrier with growing unease. American sailors moved through their duties with an efficiency born not of fear, but of genuine engagement with their work. They took pride in their specialized roles, competed for advancement through merit rather than connections, and seemed to genuinely believe that their individual contributions mattered to the larger mission. This was not the mechanical obedience that Japanese naval culture demanded, but something far more dangerous: enthusiastic participation. The contrast became most apparent during emergency drills. On Japanese ships, sailors responded to commands with immediate, unquestioning compliance, each man performing his assigned role with robotic precision. American crews displayed a different kind of coordination, one that relied on individual judgment and adaptation. When circumstances changed during a drill, American sailors modified their responses without waiting for new orders. They anticipated problems, solved issues independently, and maintained operations through initiative rather than rigid adherence to procedure. Commander Saito, who had commanded destroyers where any deviation from protocol was severely punished, found himself observing American damage control exercises with fascination and horror. When simulated emergencies arose, American crews responded with creative problem-solving that would have been considered insubordination in the Imperial Navy. Sailors suggested alternative approaches to their officers. Teams reorganized themselves to meet changing conditions. The entire response system seemed designed to harness individual intelligence rather than suppress it. The psychological implications were profound. Japanese naval culture was built on the principle that individual will must be subordinated to collective purpose. That discipline meant the complete surrender of personal judgment to higher authority. American naval culture seemed to achieve collective purpose by empowering individual judgment, creating a system where each sailor's intelligence contributed to overall effectiveness rather than being seen as a threat to order. Petty Officer Nakamura, who had served under officers who demanded absolute deference, watched American chiefs and petty officers interact with their subordinates in ways that seemed almost friendly. Advice flowed upward as well as downward. Experienced sailors taught new techniques to officers recently graduated from the Naval Academy. Knowledge and skill were valued regardless of their source, creating a learning environment that continuously improved performance. The care taken with crew welfare extended beyond material comfort to encompass psychological well-being. American naval culture seemed designed to maintain morale through positive reinforcement rather than harsh discipline. Sailors were recognized for good performance, promoted based on ability, and treated as valuable assets, whose continued effectiveness required careful maintenance. Japanese prisoners, accustomed to a system where hardship was considered character building and complaints were seen as weakness, found this approach almost incomprehensible. Lieutenant Tanaka noticed that American sailors rarely displayed the sullen resignation that characterized Japanese crews under pressure. They grumbled about assignments, certainly, but their complaints carried the tone of people who expected their voices to be heard, rather than the bitter silence of those who had given up hope of change. This difference in attitude translated directly into operational effectiveness, creating crews that remained alert and engaged even during extended deployments. The democratic principles that seemed to permeate American naval culture produced results that Japanese officers found difficult to dismiss. Ships operated more efficiently when sailors felt empowered to identify and solve problems. Maintenance was more thorough when performed by men who took personal pride in their work, rather than simply following orders. Combat effectiveness increased when crews trusted their leaders and believed in their mission, rather than simply obeying from fear. The cultural shock extended to the treatment of prisoners themselves. Where Japanese military culture might have seen captives as dishonored and therefore deserving of harsh treatment, American sailors generally showed a casual humanity that confused and disturbed their captives. Guards chatted with prisoners, shared personal stories, and seemed genuinely curious about Japanese perspectives. This behavior violated every assumption about proper military bearing, while simultaneously demonstrating a confidence that came from genuine strength rather than manufactured authority. The most unsettling aspect was the realization that this different approach to human organization was not a weakness to be exploited, but a source of strength that Japan could not match. American naval culture produced sailors who fought more effectively because they understood why they were fighting, who maintained equipment better because they took personal ownership of their responsibilities, and who endured hardships more successfully because they retained hope for improvement and reward. The strategic picture gradually revealed itself through fragments of intelligence gathered during the prisoners' extended captivity. Radio communications intercepted and discussed openly among American officers painted a vision of Pacific warfare that defied every assumption Japanese strategists had made about defensive operations. The carrier task forces were not simply naval units operating independently, but components of a coordinated offensive machine designed to systematically dismantle Japan's island empire piece by piece. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto began to understand the true horror of America's island-hopping strategy as he overheard planning discussions for future operations. The Americans were not attempting to capture every fortified island, as Japanese doctrine assumed they would. Instead, they identified key strategic positions, overwhelmed them with concentrated carrier aviation, and left heavily defended strongholds to wither without supply or reinforcement. This approach turned Japan's carefully constructed defensive perimeter into a series of isolated outposts, each vulnerable to destruction in detail. Commander Saito, who had participated in the fortification of numerous Pacific islands, realized with growing dread that American carrier mobility made traditional defensive preparations meaningless. Japanese forces had spent years constructing elaborate coastal fortifications, positioning artillery to dominate landing beaches, and creating interlocking fields of fire designed to repel amphibious assaults. Yet carrier-based aviation could strike these installations from beyond the range of defensive guns, neutralizing months of construction effort in hours of concentrated bombardment. The prisoners learned that American planning assumed carrier superiority from the outset of any operation. Where Japanese naval doctrine treated carriers as valuable assets to be protected and used sparingly, American strategy deployed them as expendable tools in service of larger objectives. Multiple carrier groups could concentrate overwhelming air power at chosen points, eliminate local resistance, and move on to the next target, while leaving minimal garrison forces to hold captured territory. Chief Petty Officer Hayashi, who had served in logistics planning, grasped the revolutionary implications of this mobile airfield concept. Traditional military operations required the establishment of secure supply lines, the construction of airfields, and the gradual buildup of forces before major offensives could be launched. American carriers eliminated these requirements by bringing their own air support, maintenance facilities, and supply systems directly to the battle zone. The speed of American operations shocked Japanese observers who had grown accustomed to the careful, methodical pace of Japanese military planning. Where Japanese forces required months to prepare for major operations, American task forces could appear anywhere in the Pacific within days, launch devastating attacks, and disappear before effective countermeasures could be organized. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently to forces that could move faster than traditional defenses could respond. Petty Officer Nakamura, who had witnessed the construction of airfields throughout the Pacific, understood that American carriers had solved the fundamental problem of projecting air power across oceanic distances. Japanese strategy depended on a network of island airfields to provide mutual support and maintain air superiority over critical sea lanes. American carriers made this network irrelevant by carrying their own airfields wherever operations required air support. The prisoners gradually realized that Japan was fighting a defensive war against an enemy that had redefined the nature of Pacific geography itself. Islands that Japanese planners considered naturally defensible became vulnerable when attackers could bring superior air power directly to the target. Supply lines that seemed secure behind vast oceanic distances became exposed to carrier strikes that could appear anywhere without warning. Lieutenant Tanaka began to comprehend the psychological dimensions of American strategy as he observed the confidence with which officers discussed future operations. They spoke of capturing islands not as desperate gambles requiring maximum effort, but as routine tasks to be accomplished according to schedule. This casual approach to what Japanese defenders considered life-or-death struggles revealed a strategic confidence born of overwhelming material superiority. The intelligence gathered from captured documents and overheard conversations painted a picture of American planning that extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives. Operations were coordinated across thousands of miles of ocean, with carrier groups, submarine forces, and land-based aviation working in concert to achieve strategic goals that Japanese defenders could not even perceive until too late. The most devastating realization was that American strategy treated the entire Pacific as a single operational theater rather than a collection of isolated defensive positions. Carrier mobility allowed American forces to concentrate superior strength at any chosen point, while keeping Japanese defenders guessing about the location and timing of the next attack. This strategic flexibility made effective defense impossible, forcing Japan into a reactive posture that guaranteed eventual defeat. The prisoners understood that they were witnessing not just superior tactics or equipment, but a fundamental revolution in military strategy that made their own training and experience obsolete. The carriers represented the visible symbol of American ability to project decisive force anywhere in the Pacific, transforming what had once been Japan's defensive advantage into a trap from which there could be no escape. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the officers who had witnessed America's floating cities from the inside carried with them memories that would reshape their understanding of modern civilization itself. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto, writing in his post-war memoirs, described his time aboard the carrier as a glimpse into the future of human organization. The abundance, the efficiency, the casual confidence of American sailors had revealed to him that Japan had been fighting not just a military force, but an entirely different model of society. Commander Saito, who became a prominent voice in Japan's post-war naval reconstruction, often returned to the lesson of the carriers when discussing the nature of national power. The Americans had not simply built better ships, he argued, but had created a system that merged industrial capacity, technological innovation, and human welfare into a seamless instrument of policy. The carriers were proof that modern warfare required not just courage and sacrifice, but the ability to mobilize the full resources of an advanced society. The cultural shock experienced by these former prisoners extended far beyond military considerations. They had witnessed a civilization that could wage total war without destroying the foundations of civilian prosperity, that could project power across the globe while maintaining democratic institutions at home. The floating cities had been laboratories of American social organization, demonstrating principles of leadership, motivation, and resource management that Japan would study and adapt in its post-war transformation. Chief Petty Officer Hayashi, who worked in Japan's reconstruction efforts, frequently cited his carrier experience when advocating for new approaches to industrial management and worker welfare. The Americans had shown that treating human resources as valuable assets rather than expendable tools produced superior results in both military and civilian contexts. The lesson extended beyond naval warfare to encompass the very foundations of modern society. For these men, the carriers had become symbols not of defeat, but of possibility. They represented proof that human ingenuity, properly organized and adequately supplied, could achieve results that seemed impossible under traditional constraints. The floating cities of war had shown them a vision of what nations could accomplish when they learned to harness the full potential of their people and resources in service of clearly defined goals.